everyone, welcome to the live stream. I'm JLo, the VP of Marketing Science here at LiftLab. And before we get into all the details, I'd like to take a second to plug the series of Curve Your Enthusiasm. Curve Your Enthusiasm is conversations and meetings with experts, growth marketers, analytics, measurement people. And the idea is to bring it from the classroom to the boardrooms. We have practitioners, academics, and strategists all coming together to make interesting conversations jargon-free. So today's episode, it is called How to Build Better Trust and Transparency in Your Marketing Mix Model with Dr. Dirk Beyer. This episode is broken up into three major topics: measurement then and now, the trends and the changes, the industry around MMM and what to look for, and then data over methods, why torturing the data won't give you better answers. So let's go ahead and meet our speakers. First up, we have the co-founder and CEO of LiftLab, previous founder of DataSong, which successfully exited to market share. We have John Wallace. John Wallace, welcome to the show.
All right. Hey, Jenna.
And then next up, we have our special guest, Dirk. Now, Dirk is an extremely accomplished individual, and I don't want to make him blush too much, but I have quite a few bullets, so I might have to read these. I know I'm not supposed to read too much off the script.
If you don't make him blush, then you haven't done your job. All right, let's get this.
Exactly. So he is a PhD in applied maths. He's worked in analytics applications to businesses since the late 90s. Marketing and analytics in particular for the past 25 years. He's built and led teams that created measurement and optimization platforms and delivered analytic insights from companies from M Factor to market share, which is now TransUnion, and Uber. He's worked with over 100 client companies and partnered with many of the players in the industry. He took a little bit of an excursion to work on identity, fraud, trust, and safety, as well as customer support analytics before coming back to marketing with Neustar and DoorDash. He's been an advisor to LiftLab for some time and recently joined as our chief data scientist. Welcome to the show, Dirk.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. You had me blush when you called me doctor. I don't hear that very often.
Dr. Dirk, I do like the ring to that in the alliteration. And for everyone in the live audience, again, say who you are, where you work, and if we can work in those questions about the topics we're talking about, we'll insert them organically. If it's a little bit of a different question, we'll save it for the Q&A at the end. We want this to be interactive. We want the people who are taking their time out of their busy workday to make sure that they're engaging with us live. So let's jump right in. We had a little bit of a pre-call, Dirk, and I think the first question that I have for you is, what made you come back to marketing analytics?
Yeah, so people who know me, who have talked to me over the last few years, know that I tried my hardest to get out of marketing analytics. Like I switched into identity and risk and fraud, because marketing analytics from a statistician's perspective is a very hard place to be. There's a lot of issues with the data, a lot of change, but I've seen that a lot of the things that I've been doing over the last 25 years are coming back. They're coming back to some extent better than they were before. We can probably talk about it a little bit, with some changes to the data and the infrastructure that's available. And also that I feel I've seen a lot of things. I've made a lot of mistakes in the past. I've ran down a lot of dead ends. So I think I can contribute a little bit based on that experience. And that's why I wanted to come back and to kind of make John blush, come back to a company that tries to acknowledge the limitations of what can be and cannot be done in this field, and be very honest and collaborative about it, rather than going back to where this industry at least was a while ago, where it's all about misdirection and all about overpromising and under-delivering.
Yep. So, Dirk, can you tell us a little bit about that evolution? I mean, you've been in the industry for a very long time, the brief hiatus, but you came back around. Could you tell me a little bit about what has evolved and what has stayed the same, like the old is the new, what has changed, and kind of those dynamics over your career?
Yeah, when I went into marketing analytics 2008, it was pretty much all regression models. It was all marketing mix models of some sort. The rage was like mixed effect models was kind of the the thing that was from a technical perspective, the highlight. These models then evolved quite a bit into more sophisticated Bayesian models that I think we have somebody from TransUnion market share here. We built models that had like lots of cross sections, that could handle Bayesian priors, that had Bayesian hierarchical estimation, that had nested models, that had floating Bayes, that had like all these bells and whistles in there, which was very hard to do at the time with the computational abilities and data abilities that we had. But that kind of was the height of that era. And then in the, I don't know when, 2015-ish, 13 or whatever, multi-touch attribution became all the rage. Everybody got enamored with the idea that we can observe things at the individual consumer level, and every solution had to be built at that level, and attempted to collect histories about individuals and then do analysis on that. Marketing mix was declared dead at the time because multi-touch attribution is going to do it all. So I worked in that field a little bit and connected MMM through MTA, and then privacy regulations came, and now suddenly MMM is dead and marketing analytics is back. So
it's the way MTA is dead. Yeah, and
MTA is dead.
Oh, we got you.
And MMM is back. So it's come to some extent full circle, but I think there are things now that make looking at MMMs and similar techniques a little bit easier and have the promise to deliver more value. One of them is that typically clients today have the data at very high granularity at their fingertips. When I started out in 2008, it was like, oh, we have to wait until our SAP implementation is done or our Salesforce implementation is done, and then we can think about marketing analytics. Now the data is available. The granular data is available from the online platforms, so we know what was executed, and more data goes through that kind. More money, more spend goes through those kinds of platforms. So data availability has gotten better, and then to be honest, computation has gotten, and storage has gotten much better as well. Like I said before, we had these fancy models, but we had to use heuristics in the backend because you just couldn't run Markov chain Monte Carlo estimation on those big models. Today, there are open source things out there that can do this. So computation has gotten better, data has gotten better, and the understanding of connecting MMM with other techniques, I think, has become more widespread as well. So it's a lot of opportunity here.
So Dirk, if I were to summarize, the signals are getting faster, more granular, cheaper to compute, cheaper to ingest, cheaper to store. But then the methodologies, once we have the data in-house, I think when we discussed it separately, like the evolution of those is not as drastic as maybe might be claimed. So could you explain kind of what your thoughts are? There's a lot of debate on LinkedIn. There's a lot of debate on the different methodologies and types. And I think we had a really interesting conversation yesterday about it. So could you tell me a little bit about the different methodologies and what you kind of like about them and what you don't?
So let me start a little bit differently. Okay. Marketers do want insights into how they are running their business. In my opinion, there are two things there. It's accountability. Marketers want to be able to say, this is what I did with the budget you gave me to play with. This is what I returned to the company. And finance is probably breathing down their neck and say, tell me what you did for us. And then the other one is they do want to make fact-based decisions. So they want to decide where to spend, where are the places where I can spend more, where should I spend less. So those things in marketing are not different than any other function in a company. And I'm comparing to supply chain because that is where I'm coming from. The big difference between marketing and a function like supply chain is, even in hindsight, even if you have the data from the past, the metrics that you care about, something like ROI or incremental return on advertising spend, they are not directly observable. in supply chain, I can go out and I can estimate my inventory turns for next quarter. I can figure out my stock out rates and estimate them. And then I come back after the quarter and I can look at the data and I can say, these were my inventory terms. This is how much I spent in interest for holding my inventory. This is how often I stocked out. And that is something that's incontrovertible. You put it on a dashboard and everybody is happy. In marketing, the question is always based on some counterfactual. What would have happened had I not run my campaign? And it's not directly observable. So you need analytics, you need some form of creating the counterfactual, and you need to have techniques that can do that reliably in a way that it's believable to marketers. So that, I think, is the difference. And the techniques that I think have crystallized by now are either experimentation, where your counterfactual assumption is that people who don't get the treatment, if I choose them wisely or randomly, then they will behave like the people who got the treatment if they didn't get it. So they can become the counterfactual, and you can compare the two and you get a result. And that is pretty much accepted. There's a lot of modeling that goes into that as well, because you have to figure out what is the population that is representative of the behavior of the treated group that got the treatment. But that is one technique. The other technique is I take all the data that was generated by the business that I'm running, and I run a regression. I take the outcomes that I care about, and I regress that against the marketing spend, but also everything else that's going on in the market, and I get a model that way. So those two techniques have always been there. I think there's more of an understanding in the industry that you have to combine the two, that one is not just there to check the other, like it was when I started. You run an MMM, and if somebody has a question about it, we say, oh, before you execute, you might want to run an experiment to check that the coefficient is right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now it's more like experiments are one data source. The data that comes directly from my business outcomes is another one. The data that I'm getting from the platforms is another one. And I have to find methods to combine them into one coherent picture. And I think that has always been in the background of the practitioners in the field, but it's becoming more and more a reality now.
Yep. I feel this reminds me very much about, John, the story you said when you approached a couple professors with a thesis saying, try to talk me out of this, and had a similar opinion. Could you kind of share about that merging of the two and kind of how that came about?
I mean, that was me thinking about how could we automate experiments. And the merging there was, could we do econometric analysis of the experiment data, right? So that felt like the market hadn't, and really, if you think about it, even today, is still not fully embraced, the opportunities from that idea. But so now you have and the question is, do you have experiment results, or do you have diminishing returns understanding from experiment? And they're just kind of cousins to one another. Well, let's take it back to Dirk. He's kind of done a good job laying it out. You've got a difficult problem in marketing that no one has consensus on how much money did we make last week, and you have to use models to derive that. Whereas I think you were comparing it to supply chain. In supply chain, you forecast how many units, and then you look at how many happen, and there's no argument there, right? There's consensus to say we had a variance of 12% or whatever. I don't know. I was trying to use the analogy in marketing. It's kind of like you're being asked to give a rain forecast, but no one agrees on how much rainfall there was yesterday. Is that kind of what you're saying?
So it's not necessarily about whether people agree or not. You get that as a result of the fact that you need to do analytics to get at the numbers. You cannot touch the number. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not just it's really you're supposed to forecast how much rain, but you're not allowed to go out and look. It's kind of the equivalent, and that makes it a little bit more difficult in marketing analytics.
And that's why you took a break. But, you're back.
So I think one thing that you mentioned, Dirk, at the offsite a while ago about how you view a market mix model as a container. Could you share a little bit about that and how you view the models and how it looks more abstractly, I guess, because I thought it was a really interesting framing.
I think in order to answer the questions that are laid out in terms of accountability and in terms of being able to figure out where to optimize and where to spend your money, where to spend your money, you need some way of evaluating scenarios that you haven't executed yet. So you want to compare your current marketing plan to some variant of that marketing plan, and you want to figure out, is that better or worse? And you can automate that through optimization. But fundamentally, what you're doing is comparing multiple marketing plans and what the predicted outcome of those predicted returns on that plan are in the tools that you want to be using. So fundamentally, what you need is a representation of the market reality that allows you to do counterfactuals, evaluation of counterfactual scenarios. Now, to do that, there is no reason why anybody would say, and by the way, that machine, that model, that mathematical expression has to be estimated from a single data set. It has to be purest, has to be one regression, and everything else is not allowed. That, I think, is stupid because it's kind of tying your hands behind your back and putting a wool over your eyes, because there are many different analyses that you can do in the field of marketing analytics that give you some more or less strong evidence about how well a certain tactic or a certain channel in marketing is working. So you can do experimentation on channels. You can, God forbid, look at what the platforms tell you was the attributed revenue. This is not the number you want. This is not your incremental revenue from the activity, but it's information that you can use. You can run regression models on the data that you have that was shed by your business when you ran it. Maybe you don't want to just run one. We have clients that have us do analysis, what we call agile mixed modeling, and they have another mixed modeling provider, and both of those results are strong in different regions and a little bit weaker in others, and you want to combine them. So the ability to take multiple analyses and put them into one machine that allows you to predict the outcome of a scenario, I think that's the reasonable person's approach to it. And typically, if you look at it, the mathematical representation that has been used in the past in those regression models is a very good way of combining all that information and holding it in one place, because those models, they account for non-linearity. So there's saturation typically built into those models. The models prevent you from double counting. They're just, if you only have one model, you can't double count the same way you would double count if you compare attributed revenue from Facebook and Google, because the same purchase event will be claimed by both of them under certain circumstances. You have marginality in the model. So if we talk about saturation, that also means that you have the ability to look at first derivatives, which is the only thing that matters when you optimize. If you think back to your calculus class, it's only the derivatives that matter when you find the critical points. So same here, you have that built into the models. You can nest them, you can do a lot of stuff in those models. So I think that the models that people have traditionally used for NNM, and I mean the models, not the parameter estimation, the structure of the models is a really good way to hold all the information and bring it in through priors, bring it into through lift curves that you estimate some other way, and then hold it in there and exercise that mathematical construct to make predictions. So that's my spiel on, it doesn't have to be a monolithic model that is estimated from one single data set. but it should be a machine, a crank that you can turn that sits in one place. So you can put an optimizer on top of it. So you could put a reporting engine on top of it, and whatever else you want to take on it.
Yep. So you mentioned something else about the information that gets put in models, specifically around hierarchical clustered models. Could you talk about the information that you gain as a modeler when going through that process?
So the reason why Bayesian models, hierarchical Bayesian models, and Bayesian models that even on top of it allow you to specify priors are so popular these days. If you ask what are you using, almost everybody's going to tell you it's some form of a hierarchical Bayesian model, is because these models allow the analyst to influence the structure of the model. And the reason why I'm saying that is just do a thought experiment. You try to build a marketing mix model on 3 years of weekly data. You have 150 something observations. But if you now say, oh, I want to use Meridian from Google as my open source tool for that, how many parameters are they asking you to estimate? Yeah, this is like maybe you have 20 marketing channels. Each marketing channel has a saturation function they call Hill function that has 2 parameters or 3 parameters. There's ad stock, which in that model has 2 parameters. So you're up to 5. You have a coefficient that is 6 times 20 is 120. There is no chance, snowball's chance in hell that you can estimate 120 parameters freely from 150 observations. In a world where the signal you're looking for is in the single percentages, it's a percent or 2, and the natural noise in the system is double-digit errors. So what you need is you need to either expand it by cross sections, but then you have to be able to say, and by the way, I expect these coefficients across cross sections to be the same or to be similar, so that you don't blow up the degrees of freedom. Or you have to be able to say, I want to estimate at this group of channels first, and then I break it out later, which is hierarchical Bayesian. So hierarchical Bayesian models allow you to reduce the number of degrees of freedom during during estimation, and that's why these models are popular, because we're living in a world where the signal to noise ratio is just so small, and the number of independent parameters that a marketer would love to know something about is infinitely big. Everybody wants to know everything time dependent and for every single campaign and for every single geography and so on. But if you were to freely estimate that, the way that, by the way, people did when I started, and then just cross out all the coefficients that were negative and declare that the model, that gives you something that is totally counterintuitive and to some extent useless for optimization. So
here's I have an example to share, right? Like you're listing out the number of parameters, and then you come along and come across the channel where the marketing team did exactly what they should do, which is it's maybe a channel that's not that big, and so they set the budget equal every day. They don't want to have a runaway budget, right? So if I had a runaway budget, that's what I would do, right? But they, maybe they hit a budget cap every day of pick a number, $5,000 a day. That's basically no variability at all, and we're trying to take no variability and from it ascertain a whole bunch of information. Isn't that kind of the extreme example of where sometimes we have expectations beyond our data set?
Yeah, I mean, that is the bane of marketing analytics, is no variability. And as you're probably going to point out, the one way to do it is artificially create variability through experimentation. And you get the double whammy, because you can now analyze the experimentation result, the experimentation data in isolation using the testing techniques that we all know. And then you can take that data that now has more variation than it would otherwise have had, you bring that back into a model. And if the granularities of the models match reasonably well, like if your tests all run daily and the data is collected daily and your models are on a daily basis, that will also help you learn more. But the big thing is contrast or variability in the data, and it's the degrees of freedom of how many parameters do I try to estimate with the number of data points I have. And then obviously, and that's something that a lot of people don't give a lot of thought to, stability of the data generation mechanism. So if we here try to focus on 1 year of daily data, but in my past we would use 3 years of weekly data, you're implicitly estimating the coefficient average over the last 3 years. So it's typically not thought that way, but if you use this long time series, you get an average over the past 3 years. So how I mean, it's fine for some form of accountability, what have I done for you over the last 3 years, but then using that and saying the last 3-year average is going to be what you should use for forecasting or for decision making next week, that is tricky. So you get into this situation where you want to read things fast, you want to read things at a high granularity, but you only have limited amount of data. So you have to look very closely, where can I get more data, or how can I isolate effects through experiments or by looking at very channel specific data, so that you can then bring it back together into a model that has sufficient detail to make it worthwhile, but also enough stability so that the results make sense.
Hey, Dirk. So this relates to a question that came up in chat from JC from Vayner Media. They were asking about the creative testing, creative side, working those into market mix models. And with the level of granularity that we have and the way that we're structuring things with, channels, tactics, campaigns, it seems like that individual creatives is obviously a very low granularity level that is beyond the model, as you mentioned. Are there any examples where they aggregate up creative types or anything that you've seen in your past that allowed some insight into how creative's performing at an aggregate level in a way that could influence creative decisions, or is that something you haven't seen before?
Well, I was going to let Dirk take a second to read this mention too, because he was presenting, and I gave this a little bit of thought. So Dirk, I'll give you a breather, and you can take a look. We're really a system about incrementality and diminishing returns, and creative. If you think about it, if we're building a model on a year of data, there's good creative and bad creative that comes and goes during that period. So I don't think of LiftLab as a kind of creative quantifier, maybe in that sense. Where we do see it is when we and also in that question was pointing out that a lot of times MMM does have kind of a focus or even an over focus on channel level data, and that's one thing that we kind of addressed, was to build a hierarchy along the media plan below channel into what we refer to as tactics, and below tactics is what we would call campaigns. And you will start to see different types of creative effects when you work down at the campaign level. The other thing that I've seen brands do is if they're trying to ask big strategic questions about creative, to do that in lift tests. So there you would say, I don't know, should I be working with lifestyle media or a call to action kind of creative? And those could be grouped and trafficked and run separately. And it could be, and I'm going on here, it could be that the answer is both, right? It could be that you would spend 1/10 of your budget on call to action and 9/10 on lifestyle, right? Like if you were to treat that as two diminishing return curves, you don't have to have a winner take all kind of framework for the experiment. And now, J-Lo, I was answering, was there another angle to the question that we wanted to get on the table?
No, I think that covers it. I mean, there is evolution in creative effectiveness. It's just how the scope fits within market mix models is to your point, a square peg in a round hole, I guess. And there are things that I do look at with creative, but the one challenge with creative is it's against an audience. When you're looking at engagements and click through, it's predicated on who the creative is being served up on. If you're serving up something on Snapchat or TikTok, you might have very different engagement than old school Facebook. So I think that's a little bit of the challenge when it comes to testing, is it's not just the creative itself, but it's the creative against the audience, which limits the robustness, because those underlying conditions change pretty drastically as your budgets change, where your investments go. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Dirk, or should we?
Yeah, so I think the question was, if I make it very specific and say, look, I'm in an agency and I'm do creative testing and I get a creative score for every creative I have. Let's assume that test was done against the right audience and in the right format, not just about the idea. Obviously, you can take a single campaign that had a creative with a given score, and you can run an in-market test on that, and you get a number of did that work or didn't it work, and how much did it work. I think if you want to incorporate that into marketing mix models, because it should be forward-looking as well, you need some form of a meta study. You need to assume that, or try to test whether creative score over a bunch of campaign actually correlates with the experiment results that you're seeing when you test the campaigns itself. And if you can do that, and if you can do that analysis and you get some correlation between effectiveness and creative score, then it's not far-fetched to take creative score as one of the input variables that you built into your container model. And you know that if you have a winner in terms of creative score, this one is going to perform a little bit better than something that's a dud. So I think, again, it's the idea of you can't do it by just looking at the 30, 60, 90 days the campaign ran and hope that in the regression it will just come out. Or you just put creative score as another variable into the model without forcing some form of a structure. But you can do meta-analysis outside and then take those learnings and bring them back so that your predictions take creative score into account.
Awesome. If we can shift gears back a little bit more about the MMM industry, I think, we talked about the confidence, the granularity, the degrees of freedom, and stretching models a little bit too far. Can you tell me a little bit about what do you think is happening that the industry might be getting wrong or right in terms of positioning, and where open source fits into the mix?
Well, you're trying to get me into trouble here with my friends. This is not a new phenomenon. It's not. It hasn't gone away either. I think in this industry there's a lot of, in the sales process in our industry, there's a lot of misdirection and a lot of overpromising things that I have no idea how that could possibly be done. And it's kind of a race to the bottom. It has been in the past, where one player in the industry say, "Oh, we can do that," and then the easiest way in a sales process, rather than trying to refute that actually doesn't seem to be doable, is to say, "Yeah, we can do that too," and then you hack something up in the backend. So I think there's too much reliance on we can torture the data, we can squeeze every information that you would want to have out of the data that your business sheds during day-to-day operations. This goes hand in hand with a kind of an arms race, or a discussion around the lines of my algorithm is bigger than your algorithm. So we differentiate because we can estimate things that nobody else can estimate. Or if you don't use this particular model setup, you're getting it wrong. And look, when I started, there were things out there. Hierarchical Bayesian is one thing. Fixed effect models was another. There were people in the market that say, unless you have a state space model, it's not good. There were people in the market, big consulting companies, that would say, unless you have a simultaneous equation model, it's no good. There's a lot of these. The Shapley values was hot for a while, not clear how that relates. Agent-based modeling was hot for a while. So a lot of people go out and say, we have this algorithm that does things that nobody else can do. Now, in reality, the limit here is the data. And there are two things here. One is the data that is generated by the business, by running your business. And you can only torture that so much. And as I said before, you're looking for 1% lifts from each individual marketing channel in a sea of 10, 20% errors. So you know that most of the results are somewhat directional, that confidence intervals around the coefficients are not single digits. If anybody tells you we get something to the second decimal place, that's bogus. So there's a lot of that out there. And we're trying to be a little bit more honest about it and then triangulate with multiple analyses to get a better feel for what all that circumstantial evidence is pointing to. So that's number one, and that is my biggest beef with this industry, a lack of willingness to say, hey, maybe this question that you're asking cannot be answered with that data. And if you want to answer that question, you have to generate data that is specific to answering that question. And you might not even be able to answer exactly the questions that you ask, but something that gets you in the direction so you can make a decision of this one is better than that one. Yeah. I always say when I talk to people, you're managing a portfolio of marketing investments the same way somebody manages a stock market portfolio. No sane person would go out and believe me if I said I have a model that predicts tomorrow's stock price. Yeah, everybody would laugh me out of the room. For some reason, in marketing analytics, that doesn't happen that quickly. But if I can build a model that is right more often than it's wrong, or gives me something that is within 50% of what the right number is, if I do this in investment circles, I'm rich beyond belief. So I think we have to realize the limitations, work with them, not be paralyzed by them, and get better and better over time what we fill in. So that's in my opinion, that is where the industry should be going. Academia should be absolutely brutal about publishing stuff about statements that are made in the industry that cannot possibly be done. I think if anybody from academia is here, don't hit me, but I think academia has dropped the ball. There's no incentive for academics to poo-poo and to be a party pooper here. But I think that there should be more of that. And then I think your second question was about the open source models.
Mm-hmm.
I think the good news is stuff that was very expensive to build in the past. If my friends from TransUnion market share look at how many engineering hours went into what we've built at the time, they are now available relatively easily. So if you look at Meridian, it's a great piece of engineering, but 80%, 90% of the work that people are doing, that they're contracting with people in the industry, is about how you set up those models. How do you figure out what the parameters are? How do you properly pre-curve the data? How do you make assumptions on what is the same, what is not the same? If you don't normalize things right, these models blow up. So there's a lot of work that goes in understanding the data generation mechanism and make the right choices in those models. And that is where 80-90% of the work is. So just thinking that you take an off-the-shelf algorithm, and I mean, I've built something that looks very much like Meridian with the team in my past. At Uber, we built Orbit and released it into open source. So I don't want to poo-poo the open source stuff. It's hot stuff, but using it requires a very, very big level of experience and a very deep understanding of the marketing science side of it. The statistics is kind of done for you, but the marketing analytics side needs to be there. And a lot of people, what I've seen, underestimate that and they think they just take a fancy estimation algorithm and they throw it at the data set that was properly QA'd, and now suddenly a model comes out on the other end that makes any sense. But that is often not the case. You need to understand, why didn't it work? What assumptions can I make that are legitimate so that I get something in the out that supports the decisions that I want to make?
It's almost as if open source is making people create cheaper planes, faster planes, and more robust planes, but we're not creating more pilots. And without trading more pilots, you have a bunch of plane crashes everywhere because they have the tools to use it, but maybe not the expertise on how to utilize it appropriately. Would that be a fair analogy, or
Yeah,
am I?
and you're the king of analogies. My one is like, somebody who knows how to play the guitar and is really good at it can make a piece of crap sound really good. And I can take the most expensive guitar and it doesn't sound like anything. So it's not it's in most cases, it's not the guitar, it's how you play it and what you know and how you understand music, not the craftsmanship that went into the instrument.
This is a common theme from our second Curve Your Enthusiasm. It's not the data, it's how you use it that Kuhn Powell's had. So I'm seeing a through line of the utilization of it is extremely important. And I think that gets us into our last topic that we could hit very briefly, which is what does getting the data right mean? So, as you're getting this data in your models, there's a level of understanding and interpretation that needs to happen. Could you talk a little bit about that? You talked about it a little bit on the hierarchical models, but could you talk about like how not all data is equal and how it might be interpreted differently?
Yeah, I think often when people think about getting the data right, they are first and foremost thinking about where can I pull it from? Can I QA the data so that I know it's all there and it's correct in some sense? And I think that is table stakes. If you don't do that right, you have no chance to do anything good. But in most cases, I believe the more important thing is understanding, how is this data collected? What does it really mean? And what are the limitations? So if you take attributed revenue on the Facebook campaign, you look in the interface, you actually get exactly what they tell you. It's attributed revenue for the customers that we can. You give me the outcome data, you give Facebook the outcome data. Facebook says, I have shown this ad to that person within 3 days before they purchased, and that's going to be the attributed number. Now, where are the issues with that? You need to understand that data. You need to understand that there are matching issues. Yeah, so sometimes I'm sending the data over and Facebook can't find that customer, even though it might be a customer there because there's a mismatch in hashed email or whatever mechanism is being used. There is the notion that Facebook might claim it and Google might claim it at the same time because you have been to both sites and you have seen an ad on both sites. So there is double counting. There's probably a lot of other issues with that data that unless you know that, you might not know how much you can trust it and where you should put it in the model. Is it something that should be corroborating evidence, or is it the thing that you make your decision on? And if you have this data from Google and this data from Facebook, how do I combine the two into a combined view so that it's actually still correct? So those kinds of things, know your data, understand the limitations, and then figure out with the data limitations, what can you still do with it? I think that is where most of the expertise in marketing analytics goes in. That's number one. Number two, I think John mentioned that already. If you can find reliable, more granular data, and if you can't find it, make it. Yeah. If you can't find it, try to run experiments, or at least to some extent have in your mind that unless I'm creating some variability in my execution streams, I will not be able to measure anything on the other side. So this is I think that I would say a large portion of setting up a marketing analytics, marketing measurement practice is having those discussions internally or externally with your partners of what data do we want to use, what's good about it, why am I expecting a report on this side to look somewhat different from a report on that side because it's not exact. Even though they say they measure the same thing, it sounds like it's the same thing. In reality, it isn't. So I think that's where a lot of the experience goes.
Yep. So it's almost like a game of telephone, and it shortens as you have more context of what things to look out for, and that's why seeing a lot of models and doing a lot of the data wrangling as well as the execution makes you a better modeler overall. It shortens the distance there. Is that a fair summary there?
And then I want to use my typical soapbox spiel as well, internally and externally. I distinguish very much between the exercise of modeling, which is trying to represent the process that I want to describe in a mathematical or analytical form with some open parameters in it, and the statistics of it, the estimation of the parameters. One is a math exercise. That one is well taught at universities. People understand it. You can get really good statisticians. You need experience there too. It's not an easy job, but you can get good people there easily, relatively early out of school. And then there is this notion of, did I get the representation right? Does the data actually mean what I think it means? And that is the modeling part. And that one is the one where you really need to, this is an exercise, I always say it's an exercise in psychology, not an exercise in math. You have to understand how marketing influences individuals and how individual response data aggregates up into the cohorts that you typically see the data for. Unless you make the mental effort to understand that, you can build a beautiful statistical model that is totally meaningless.
So there's the modeling side and then the optimization side, and I guess the question is, when you're looking at the models, is that a little bit more looking back to fit information while optimizing and whatnot might be looking forward for forecasting and other things? Like how, I mean, I probably have that wrong, so please correct me. But how would you, I mean, it's both trying to depict the same reality, but how would you separate those out and then bring them together? Is that?
So the two things I was separating out in my previous statement was calibration of the model, which is the statistical part, and setup of the model. All of them are a description of the historical data, or a way of encapsulating what you, the royal we, have learned from the past, either from the data set or multiple data sets. So now, the only reason why you're doing this is because you want to learn from the past to make decisions in the future. And then the question becomes, okay, now I have a model, the structure is right, the structure is in sync with how we think the world works. Now I can use that to evaluate future scenarios. And I can do that either one by one. I have 5 different plans, pick me the best one, the one that gives me the highest revenue, or that best trade-off between profitability and revenue. Or you can use an optimization tool, and now I'm back to my early roots of supply chain and operations research. You can phrase that as there are constraints of things that you are allowed to do. I have a budget, and I don't want to make changes more than 20%, and I can't add more money there because I'm already buying every keyword at Google that I'm buying. So put constraints and ask the question, where is the optimal point on your objective function? So that's the optimization part. And a lot of the platforms that you have in the solutions that you have in the industry will have a functionality that tells you, okay, we think you should be spending more there and less there. But you first have to convince yourself that your model is correct on the historical data and has some bearing on the future. It's not something that I'm estimated from 3 years of history, but now the world has changed. Now that's the modeling part. Optimization is the use of the models for decision support.
Got it. All right, so we only have a few minutes left. That was a super helpful summary, and I think that last point is a very well made point, and something that might be, I don't want to say contrarian, but unique. So thank you for sharing that. I want to make sure that we have any time for questions or anyone else in the chat. The chat seems to be a little quiet today. Are you guys just blown away by Dirk that you're speechless, or do you have some questions you were waiting for the end? You know, give me a gut check, or even just your feedback or opinions. How much you like Dirk? How John and I are only like 20 feet away from each other, but we had to be in separate rooms for production. If not, we can wrap a little bit early. Going once. All right. Well, thank you, JC from the audience, for your question and participation. Thank you, everybody else, for tuning in. Oh, here we go. Marty at the buzzer. Thank you, Marty. Any suggestions on better instituting MMM in optimization support? Let's say LC or platform that gets a readout every week.
I guess LC's last click.
Last click.
Last click. Yeah. Yep. Oh, just last click. Oof.
So I do think, so I guess I was poo-pooing in platform allocated revenue, which basically is last click. That doesn't mean that there's no information in that data. We need to realize that regression is always going to be about averages across time and space. How long you take the average is a different thing. So people can tell you, oh, I updated my regression model every time I upload data on a weekly basis. But in reality, you only update your average over the last, whatever your window is that you're doing your regression. So it's not a kind of a Twitch response. I just created that new campaign and I want to see how it works. You will see in data that comes from the platform whether you get the click-through rates that you are expected. Yeah, if you don't see any attributed revenue in the platform, it's probably not working. The other way around, that if you see a lot, you have to be a little bit careful to not overestimate the good that you did, because it's not incremental. But there is information there. I think you have to modulate this with incrementality that you might get from some other model. You have to be careful about it. But the best information, I think, at a very granular level that you can get is taking some form of ratios or day over day change or something like that averages out the flaws of that data and apply that to the data that you have averaged over a longer period of time. So the averages, the levels come from a longer time horizon, but what we think is happening today comes from a modulation that comes from that data. I think that is legitimate. It's not perfect, but it's better than not looking at day-to-day change.
Yeah, I mean, I got the question is a little easier, maybe just that recognizing that we are calculating, an attribution, if you want to call it that, or a decomposition or a set of weights unique to every day. And we are looking at I think the question was about every week. Yeah, so we are looking at the last 7 days of data, dynamically figuring out where should the credit go and doing that calculation. And I think that maybe we didn't address that earlier in the call, but that's kind of already part of the solution. So let's look back at the question. Any better instituting MMM?
Yeah, I do have one note, and this is something that I brought up on another call about last click, and I'm going to use a different analogy this time since I love my analogies, is if, let's say I had opened a pizza shop and I was handing out 50% coupons and I handed it out right in front of my door, those people could have been walking in the door anyways. So that last click is people with high intent geographically right next to my restaurant. This is kind of like your Amazon or people looking for keywords on Google. They're already in a high intent state. Now, let's say I'm giving away pizza coupons at a mall across town, 50% off. Now, that's a lot further away. Those are your TikToks, your entertainment type platforms. They're not going to get good last click metrics across anything, regardless of what they report on, because the path to get from the mall to my pizza shop is too far. So really what we want to know is what is convincing people to go in the pizza shop, not how qualified the audience is. And last click has great information to say, how close are you to the pizza shop, but whether or not that ticket worked or it convinced new people, that's that incrementality story. So to me, there's a lot of value of convincing someone at a mall to go across the pizza shop as opposed to just discounting what I already would have gotten in the door anyways. So that last click, while quick, is a little bit more biased to how qualified the audience is and less about did the ad actually work. And this is why market mix talks about the incrementality of how much more revenue you would get because they pull out a baseline. While last click says, were we the last thing to convince them to come in the door or the last thing they touched? It might not have convinced them rather. So that's kind of a little bit of an apples and oranges, but that information is extremely valuable. If you want to make short-term revenue and you have some people qualified already, how do we get them to convert? Last click is fine. But if you're making a holistic media strategy, you'd want a little bit more.
I think the question was about just that, instituting it, right? So a lot of people look at last click every week because it's just timely, it's refreshed quickly. Some people try to put factors on it. I don't think either of those ideas is very strong. I think we're taking for granted here. What we want to spell out is we do calculate MMM every week on the last 7 days, and you'll get a different answer for Monday than you will on Wednesday of last week, depending on what the shape of the media plan was. And I think that was kind of where it lies. But I think we're probably at time in terms of trying to field any more opening any other topics.
There's just agreement with this one. I agree that open source is great, but there's so many traps in MMM that building an in-house model without help can be risky. And also, Dirk is cool. So congrats, Dirk.
And then I know. Let's end.
Yep, cool.
All
So
right.
thank
Somebody
you
else comes with a
time.
different comment.
Yep, and on our next Curb Your Enthusiasm is May 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific time. So we'll see you then. Again, thank you, Dirk, for showing up. Thank you for all the great questions, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one.